Hey, it's me, I'm back, and this is Sacrifices Must Be Made, a London Diary submission about playing a game of cards in a cabin against a stranger. You are starving. If you beat him, he will give you something to eat. As the name suggests, the central mechanic is about making sacrifices, starting with weak cards, lowly squirrels and stoats, eventually working your way up to wolves and grizzly bears. Now this probably looks familiar if you've clicked on this video. It's the prototype for Inscryption. It's amazing to see just how much of it is on display here. Sure, the story itself has been swapped out, but the core mechanics of Inscryption, what you do in Inscryption, it was all conceived in a mere 48 hours. No need to find the fun is already here, it's just a case of drawing the rest of the stoat. Now, this is an odd one. Game jams are an odd one. There are definitely examples of game jams being a solid way of prototyping an idea, seeing if it resonates with people, and then shaping it into its own fully fledged thing. But there are many more examples of that not happening. Game jam games are not commercial games. You could not sell Sacrifices Must Be Made for £16 in the same way that you could not sell my crappy card game where you only play one hand for £16. One is obviously much better than the other, but both are game jam games. So the question facing the Inscryptions and the roller domes and the mini metros of the world is how? How do you take your game jam game and turn it into a commercial one? How do you take it further? If you've played Inscryption, you already know how, although I guess it's less of a how and more of a how. What kind of game is Inscryption? Well, Sacrifices Must Be Made had the shell of a solid roguelike deck builder that could have easily gone the way of Slay the Spire or Monster Train. You already know that lumping it into this category feels wrong. It's not really a roguelike deck builder. Don't get me wrong, there is a roguelike deck builder in Inscryption, but there's more to it than that. If you go in expecting a clear-cut, all-Canadian roguelike deck builder, then you're going to be disappointed. What Inscryption is, at its core, is a card game about card games. Okay, you know what a card game is. You've played at least one card game in your life. You've played Inscryption. If you've not played Inscryption, you might not get much out of this. But there's one thing we need to sort of establish here when it comes to card games. The idea of mechanics versus flavor. What do I mean by that? Well, this here is a Yu-Gi-Oh card. It's my favourite Yu-Gi-Oh card called Guardian of the Wind and Water. Now, you might not know what a Yu-Gi-Oh card is. There are lots of things on a Yu-Gi-Oh card. So this is a fusion monster card. We know that because it's purple. A fusion monster card has a name, it has an attribute, it's got a level, a type, the monsters needed to summon the card, the effect text that explains what the card does, an attack and defense value, and finally, strangely overlooked, a drawing of what Gate Guardian of Wind and Water looks like. Now, we can categorize each section of the card here into either being flavor or mechanics. For example, the effect text of the card is very much mechanics, as is the attack and defense values. Gate Guardian of Wind and Water being a spellcaster is mechanics, of course. There are cards out there that provide support to spellcasters. In the same way, you can think of the wind attribute as a kind of type, but it's much more broader. And of course, there's levels which have mechanical importance. Okay, so that's a lot of mechanics, right? Well, I suppose Team Flavor gets a few concessions. The name is flavor, the card could be called anything and it wouldn't affect its mechanics. And we're also, once again, overlooking the giant illustration in the middle. That's definitely flavor. You can't play Yu-Gi-Oh just by looking at the pictures, despite what my primary school friends told me. Now, obviously this seems like a bit of a dub, as the kids say, for mechanics. Despite the picture being center stage, you could argue that the number of elements that are mechanics as it be. Well, okay, no, not really. I'm misleading you a little bit. It's not so easy to mark everything here into discrete elements. A type, for example, is flavor. You might think spellcasters or dinosaurs or dragons are really cool, and you can feasibly build a deck around each of them. The same goes for attribute. You could even argue that the number of attack points this monster has is flavor. Let me tell you, not many cards out there have a 50 in their attack. This extra 50 is a callback to the original Gate Guardian. And yeah, you can probably see where I'm going with this. The effect text of Gate Guardian of Wind and Water, the mechanics of Gate Guardian of Wind and Water is flavor. This new line of monsters is about the original pieces of the Gate Guardian coming together, and so the mechanics of the new Gate Guardian cards represents that flavor. The main point here, the reason why Yu-Gi-Oh, or indeed feel free to insert any good popular trading card game here, is so beloved that it interweaves its mechanics with flavor into a sort of homogenized soupy mess of play. Indeed, card games' digital counterparts get this right too. Even something like Slay the Spire has flavour, not just residing in the random events, relics, and enemy designs, but in the cards themselves. Fan favourites being fan favourites not because of their utility, but because the claw is law. Okay, going back to Inscryption, in fact, going back even further to Sacrifices Must Be Made, you've made that game and people enjoyed it, and you want to make a full version. So you look at what people liked about it, and it's largely down to the atmosphere. A mysterious cabin with a mysterious stranger playing a mysterious card game. Sacrifices Must Be Made is not an abstracted game like a typical roguelike deck builder. In Cobalt Core, you are piloting a spaceship to the titular core in order to try and break a time loop, but you're not actually piloting the ship. It's not a spaceflight simulator, it's abstracted. The cards represent the series of actions you can take in combat that, in the player's mind, flies the ship. Inscryption is not this. It sounds like it could be this, but it's not. It's a simulated card game. And I don't mean simulated as in like the physics are real or it's, delivering tomatoes to Luxembourg, but Inscryption, the card game, is real. It's in-universe. In the prototype, you can literally see your hand. Cards flick across the table, score is kept and turns are passed by a diegetic set of scales and a bell respectively. Inscryption is not a game about playing cards, it is a game about playing a player playing cards, and that presents a pretty good opportunity for some flavour in a way that its contemporaries can't do. The first act of Inscryption explores this idea of flavour to the point where it resembles more of a D&D campaign than a roguelike deck builder. Much is shrouded in mystery, and the intricacies of the game must be intuited by, it's almost like a systemic game in that regard. The raven can fly over any opposing cards because it's a bird. The stink bug reduces your opponent's attack because it's stinky. The cat can be sacrificed 9 times because it has 9 lives. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that. In the in-between moments, you'll be met with a pelt seller that sells you pelts, or a mysterious beast that challenges your deck. I think the best microcosm of this kind of design is the campfire, an event where you can power up one of your cards by leaving it near the fire, the friction being that if you leave it for too long, ravenous survivors will swiftly devour it. While some games represent this type of encounter with a direct percentage, Inscryption purposely leaves you in the dark to give it some extra bite. Now, don't get me wrong, Act 1 is still a mechanically solid roguelike deck builder. I don't want to pretend mechanics were ignored. There were literally thousands of playtesters for this game, and they all provided both qualitative and telemetric feedback. But I don't think this resulted in the same kind of balance that you get with a traditional roguelike deck builder. It's kind of easy to break this game, way easier than its peers. The Mantis God can be engineered for a first turn kill, or the Ouroboros can be infinitely sacrificed for a tear of a threat. Hell, the Adder can just one-shot the moon. And this would be a problem if the first act of Inscryption was a roguelike deck builder in the same way that, say, the Spire is a roguelike deck builder. But remember, Inscryption is not a roguelike deck builder, it's a card game about card games. And so while the first act of Inscryption explores the flavour that permeates throughout card games, what happens next is a slow and steady translation to the other side. Act 2 of Inscryption acts as an intermission of sorts, a bridge between the first and the third. In this act, Inscryption is no longer a roguelike deck builder, it's a digital version of Inscryption, the card game. It has you wandering around a world kind of like you're playing Pokemon, challenging all kinds of beasts, wizards and skeletons to battle. Because it's not a roguelike deck builder, the entire framing of the game has changed, even down to how you play it. You can build your deck at any time, picking from an ever-increasing pool of collected cards. Even something simple like what happens when you lose the game has changed. It's no longer the run-ending threat it was because, well, there are no runs. If you lose, then you're more than welcome to try again, maybe pick some better cards next time. This act also offers a glimpse into the wider world of Inscryption. If you were paying close attention during Act 1, it turns out Leshy, the beast guy you're playing against, is not the only one like that. There's 4 actually. And it also turns out that the mechanic of sacrificing cards is his thing, it's his entire deal. Bones were borrowed from Gamora, which leaves 2 entirely new mechanics. Energy and Mox, both representing probably the energy and land system in Magic the Gathering? I don't know, I've played about 41 minutes of Arena, and I remember absolutely nothing about it. Complete cultural black spot for me. The point is that further complexity is being introduced to the game of Inscryption. The Mox system is complicated, the energy system may be a little less complicated, but nonetheless is another thing to keep track of. Act 2 can often be overwhelming. The game, or perhaps more accurately the game space, has essentially quadrupled in size. There's more, there's now skeletons, wizards, and robots. It's truly becoming a trading card game in its variety of card designs. The starting hour or so in this act is an exercise in frustration. You start out with terrible cards and you have to score the first few wins on the board in order to get better ones. Games are often decided in the first few rounds. The game itself just doesn't feel as balanced as it did in the first act, and it kind of makes sense, right? Like, the cards have to do the same thing that the cards do in the first act, but the game has been given an entirely new frame. Death has been downgraded to a minor inconvenience, and so in order to make up for that, the game is more difficult to an annoying degree. And so on and so on. Look, you probably know this, right? I think the common consensus is that while Inscryption still maintains a high level of quality beyond this point, it never quite matches the atmosphere and tight design of the first act, and is instead known for what Daniel Mullins, the developer himself, is known for: the meta game, the game inside of a game, the motivation being to find out what is going to happen next. But you could argue this is doing Inscryption a bit of a disservice here, because we're ignoring the fact that Inscryption exists in the context of all of which it lives and what came before it. And I'm not just talking about its place in the game itself as the bread that holds the meat of the game burger together, but within the context of video games as a whole. In-universe, this version of Inscryption is the digital version of the card game released in the past. Released on these sort of weird looking squares that kind of resemble a save icon. It's an intentionally old game, and more to the point is intentionally evoking the digital versions of these actual real-life card games. Mullins specifically cites the Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color as an inspiration for this act, which is interesting because when I was playing it, I thought of the old Yu-Gi-Oh games. So it's not just one specific card game that Act 2 resembles, it's arguably all of them. By the way, I was joking earlier. I know what a floppy disk is. I was around for floppy disks. I'm not that young. Anyway, if you've played these games before, you know how much Inscryption resembles them. They often offer sparse tutorials and limited progression. The cards that you get at the start are usually terrible, the aggressive monetization of their paper counterparts being emulated digitally in the form of long grinds for packs. So at the risk of "that's the pointing" you all hear, maybe that's the point. Not only is the second act of Inscryption recreating a relic of the past, but it's also doing it at a time where the player is meant to be confused. Again, Daniel Mullins specifically cites Act 2 as him wanting to give the feeling of getting to the end of the game and then realizing that it's only just begun. Inscryption is taking a risk here, it's doing something uncomfortable. It's like how Tartarus in Persona 3 is a slog, or Far Cry 2 is an oppressive malaria-riddled marathon, or how Void Stranger does the things that Void Stranger does. I should make a video about Void Stranger. If we were appraising Inscryption from a so-called objective standpoint, if we were out here putting scores next to the graphics and the gameplay, the sound, then sure, Act 2 of Inscryption would take a few knocks. But I kind of like this part of the game, not through any kind of pragmatic reasoning, but because it's charming. It resembles the games of my childhood, the games that I still occasionally crack open today, and because I can tell that the creator of Inscryption clearly loved these games as well. Games that weren't perfect, games that had ridiculous difficulty spikes and chasms, games where you basically had to cheat or grind for dozens of hours in order to get the cards you wanted. But games that had a certain kind of magical quality that you can only get from a marriage of the physical and the digital. The wonder of these cards brought to life. So if anything, I like Act 2 of Inscryption as a homage to the digital versions of TCGs. In isolation, it genuinely stands among the pantheon, warts and all. Within the game itself, it's also a bridge between flavour and mechanics. And now it's time to explore the other side. This is Poe. It's one of the 4 aforementioned scribes in Inscryption. He's a little robot, also unbeknownst to the player as the Stoat in Act 1. If we consider Act 1 to be the exploration of flavour in card games, then Poe, acting as the Stoat, is the single drop of mechanics. Okay, well, maybe mechanics is actually the wrong word. What I'm really talking about here is metagaming. The idea that Inscryption or any card game has a pool of cards and items and sigils, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And if you want to succeed at Inscryption, it's your job to pick the best ones. It's your job to pick the best items, pick the best spot for your cards, to draw the right cards from the right piles, even pick the right nodes on the map to travel towards. And if you don't do that, well, that right there is a... In Inscryption's third and final act, Poe, the arbiter of metagaming, is given control. Unlike Leshy, Poe is an intentionally bad DM. It's safe to say that he's not concerned with flavour at all. The world of his game is directly lifted from that of the actual game, characters and all. Instead, he finds himself more concerned about the card game itself. His own archetype of energy and robots takes centre stage, a heavy emphasis on balance and mechanics. Must have gone to the Blizzard School of Design, am I right, gamers? The mechanics of Inscryption are transformed from in-universe to what they actually are. Shops are shops, currency is currency. Creating and upgrading your cards is creating and upgrading your cards. In reluctance to borrow anything from his opposite, Act 3 of Inscryption does not take the form of a roguelike deck builder and instead resembles a stripped-back version of Act 2, one where very little care and attention has been paid to its world building. What results is a game that feels like it has more structure and opacity than its shadowy counterpart, but also one with less soul. It's simply encounter after encounter. Even the bosses, the most interesting parts, aren't from Poe's Inscryption. They're not things that it is made for the purposes of creating an enjoyable game, but ones created for the purpose of his plan. It's all quite effective because you've played hours, if not dozens of hours of this card game by now. You know it inside out, and so these kinds of changes can be made. Inscryption can be remixed, and you're probably not going to feel as overwhelmed as you did in Act 2. Instead, Act 3 is about breaking Inscryption down to a science. There's no real surprise in the ebb and flow of the game, it's just about proper execution. There's something to be said about how satisfying it feels to do this, not to mention there's a lot of charming commentary on game design mixed in, but I can't help but have this sort of strange feeling when I play Act 3. It's something that shouldn't make sense given this game's popularity, but also sort of does. Inscryption, the card game, is kind of bad? Like, its blending of mechanics is just a bit much to the point of parody. There's no real consistency between all four of these mechanics, and so the arena in which they're used is actually quite narrow. Most of these cards aren't really that interesting. I have no idea what's going on with the wizards, but I feel like it's the embodiment of that gymnastics meme. I don't know why you'd put yourself through all of that when there's easier ways of winning. Maybe I'm falling into the metagaming trap there, but I don't know, they just don't feel fun to play and they're not properly thought out. It feels both slow and fast at the same time. Games are rounds upon rounds of boredom or a frustrating blitz of victory or defeat. The winning strategy of Inscryption, the card game, seems to be to create a powerful card as quickly as possible and then go for the win, to the point that, despite technically being a symmetrical game, is stacked massively in your opponent's favour. It's really no surprise that Act 3, which is Inscryption the card game at the peak of all of this nonsense, is considered the weakest because it's the purest form of Inscryption the card game. The moody atmosphere of the first act has been stripped out, and the game itself has to be addressed on its own mechanical merits, of which it has few. To be clear, I'm specifically talking about Inscryption the card game that exists in Inscryption the video game, and not Inscryption the video game, like the one you can purchase on Steam. In order to visit the four corners of the card game map, it has to cover all of this ground, right? It has to be warped and mutated in these different ways that wouldn't quite work if this was a real card game. Inscryption, the video game's goal, is not to create a good card game, it's to explore what card games are, where they reside, how they work, their place among video games as a whole. And the game has done that by now. There's no need for it to stick around for much longer. An experiment gone too far. A mechanical monster beyond all recognition. Inscryption doesn't just end, it gets deleted. There's a sense of finality that's not there when you reach A20 and slay the Spire. Inscryption was never designed to be played forever. Many of its game-breaking facets are there to facilitate that. Even when the game doesn't have an end, even when people wanted to play Act 1 over and over again and they got it in the form of Casey's mod, it still doesn't feel quite right. It's impossible to disassociate this part of Inscryption from the rest of it. It's even been balanced in the way that other roguelike deck builders have been balanced. You can't one-shot the moon anymore, you can't abuse the Ouroboros. It's become the very thing that Act 3 of the game is parodying. The flavorful parts of Act 1 are reclaimed by metagaming and mechanics. In order to beat this version of Inscryption, you're gonna have to start playing optimally. If Inscryption is a roguelike deck builder, if Casey's mod makes it a roguelike deck builder, then for me, if I'm being honest, it's probably not even in my top 5. No, that's not why I like Inscryption. That's not why I think Inscryption is a good video game. At the climax of Inscryption, as the game is in the process of deletion, you descend to the depths of the code. The 3 scribes, with their albeit brief freedom, go back to doing what they love, being your opponent. All 3 of them cherish the last few rounds they have with you. When their time is up, they reach their hand across the table. Good game. That's it right there. That's what Inscryption is. Inscryption is made by someone who clearly loves card games, who has a lot of respect for them and wanted to explore what makes them special within the climate of video games and hell, outside of video games too. The pack opening videos are a nice touch. It has a level of sincerity, even when it's at its most cynical, that could have only been done by someone who loves card games. In amongst all the mechanics and the metagaming and the mysteries, Inscryption ends with card games at their simplest. The joy of playing whoever sat across from you. Hello there, it's me. It's been a while. Sorry about that. Thank you for watching. I hope you're all doing well. I don't really have an excuse for where I've gone. I've just not really felt like making videos. And I don't know what all of you think about this, but I feel like not many interesting games have been released this year that I really want to talk about. There have been good games for sure, games that are sort of fine, but not games that I'd really want to actually talk about at length. So that's probably the primary reason why it's been a while. Anyway, hopefully it won't be as long until the next one. We'll see. But yeah, take care.